So, what do you know about Tolkien so far, Clifford?
I do not know all that much besides what you told me. Going into this, I knew that he wrote most of these stories in the first half of the 20th century. He fought in World War One, and he inspired a generation of fantasy and mythology stories. He's also, I know that he's British and that he was a professor of some sort.
Yeah, what kind of professor? What was his subject area?
I don't think I could tell you. English literature or something like that.
Right, so he's specifically focused, he would call himself a philologist, which literally translates to a word lover of words. Do you know anything about philology?
So philology is the study of language and words as they relate to history and culture. So think of it as like the archaeology of words and language. It's very closely related to etymology, which is basically the genetics of words, where they come from, how they've evolved. But philology incorporates context, so it's a slightly broader view. We can look at philology, the word philology itself, with these methods. So it's a word that has its origins in ancient Greek, meaning, like Patrick said, love, philos, of literature or words, logos. Similar words exist in Latin and all the Romance languages, but not in older languages, so we can therefore infer that the Greeks invented it, or likely started that way of thinking about words. In modern English, though, it's come to mean something more specific. It's basically a history of literature. Tolkien was fascinated by this, and he was a professor of it. And so throughout Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, we've got examples of words that Tolkien's created or inserted with very particular significance, and we'll try to break that down for you. Talk about why he's using a certain word, not a different word, or why an invention of his is relevant in terms of a broader history.
Right on. I think we'll dive into that as we go into it. But as this is the introduction to the Talking Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien podcast, I think it's pretty important that we just paint some broad strokes of his life at this point. I'm just going to run through some points of his life here, just to give you context, because, again, we'll be drawing on this throughout the podcast. So, both his parents were English. Tolkien himself was born in South Africa because his dad had a business there at the time. Went on a vacation with his mom and his brother back to England, extended vacation. During that time, his dad ended up suddenly dying in South Africa, so the mom decided to stay back in England with all of her relatives. Tolkien lived in and around the outskirts of, moving throughout this time, Birmingham, which it's in the same location as it is today. So look up a map of Birmingham in the United Kingdom, and you'll see where he grew up. One major event in his family was, while Tolkien was a youngster, his mom converted to Roman Catholicism. At the time, this is the 1900s. Yeah, 1900s. So turn of the century. In England, that was a big no-no. That was a big deal. She was basically ostracized from her family.
Because most of England's Protestant, right?
Correct.
Anglican.
Yes. Yeah. And she ended up dying when Tolkien was 9 years old. She entrusted Tolkien and his brother's name is Hilary, by the way, to the guardianship of the local priest, Father Francis. Tolkien went on to go to St. Edward's School for the, I guess, equivalent of, in America at least, of middle school and high school. From there, he got into Oxford at Exeter College to study classics, but eventually he switched to English literature. During his time at Oxford, World War I broke out. Most people his age would have immediately enlisted, but he only had 1 year left in his degree, so he decided to finish that up beforehand. During this time, he also married the equivalent of his high school sweetheart, who was Edith. From there, he was in training for World War I and did get sent to the trenches. He fought in the Battle of the Somme, which was one of the bloodiest World War I. During that time, he was actually a signaler in the trenches, which that job definitely increased his chances of survival. The whole conflict was extremely deadly, but he was on the front lines, but he wasn't the leader of like a charge.
But some of his friends were killed.
Oh yes,
right?
yeah. He had a solid group of close friends, and many of them died during this conflict. I'm sure throughout the show we'll touch on who they were and everything about them. So he was in the Somme during the fall of 1916, but he eventually got trench fever, and that actually got him out. That's what saved him. He was stuck in hospital and switched from hospital to hospital throughout all of England. When he was like somewhat able-bodied enough, he was put on basically night coast patrol for on the English coast to watch out for basically the German Navy. After the war, he was in desperate need of a job, which probably everybody was, but he was also like newly married, had one kid at the time. So he got a job working on the Oxford Dictionary. He worked specifically on the letters U, V, and W. So if you can find whichever edition it was, most of the entries for those letters probably would have been exclusively written by J.R.R. Tolkien himself. He got his first big break as a professor at the University of Leeds in about 1920. During this time, he started having all his kids with Edith, and the kids' names were John, Michael, Christopher, and Priscilla in that order. In 1925, he got his big break, set up the rest of his career as a professorship in an Oxford seat.
Pretty interesting. So it sounds like World War I was a pivotal event.
Indeed. I think it was for everybody that fought in that.
Certainly. And after that, he basically got absorbed into the life of a professor, at which point he started writing these stories.
Right. So one of the main sources that we'll be using for this podcast is Humphrey Carpenter's biography of J.R.R. Tolkien. There's just this one quote that I love. He just interrupts his whole book just to say like this one passage. It was really good. I think it's pretty fitting to read here. It fits in right where we left off. He got his job at Oxford, and was his defining profession. So I'm just going to take the time to actually read this here. And after this, you might say nothing really happened. Tolkien came back to Oxford for 20 years, went to live in a conventional Oxford suburb where he spent his retirement and died a peaceful death at the age of 81. It was an ordinary, unremarkable life held by countless other scholars. And that would be that. Apart from the strange fact that during these years when nothing happened, he wrote 2 books that have become world bestsellers, books that have captured the imagination and influenced the thinking of several million readers. It is a strange paradox, the fact that The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are the work of an obscure Oxford professor who lived an ordinary suburban life, bringing up his children and tending his garden. Or is it? Is not the opposite precisely true? Should we not wonder instead at the fact that a mind of such brilliance and imagination should be happy to be contained in the petty routine of academic and domestic life, that a man whose soul longed for the sound of the waves breaking against the Cornish coast should be content to talk to old ladies in a lounge of a hotel at a middle-class watering place, that a poet in whom joy leapt at the sight and smell of logs crackling in the grate of a country inn should be willing to sit in front of his own hearth warmed by an electric fire with stimulated glowing coal. What do we make of that? Perhaps in his years of old age we can do no more than observe and puzzle, or perhaps, slowly, we shall see a pattern emerge.
So it's pretty interesting. He's pointing out that in Tolkien's own life we've got a conflict or maybe a contrast between regular existence and longing for something greater, something different. And I have a feeling that's something we're gonna get back to in the stories as that relates to some of the characters in both The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings.